Welcome to the campus of the National Hispanic Cultural Center, and I would like to welcome you all to one of our programs in the La Canoa Legacy Talk that is a collaboration between the National Hispanic Cultural Center and the Center for Regional Studies. The Center for Regional Studies is dedicated to the creation of knowledge about New Mexico, the greater Southwest as a region, its connections to northern Mexico, Latin America, and Spain. The La Canoa Legacy Talks take their inspiration from the very word La Canoa, which can have several meanings. Here at the campus of the National Hispanic Cultural Center, we have a more modern rendition, an artistic rendition of La Canoa, which you can see to my right. The piece here reminds us, el agua es vida. We also want our talks to create knowledge, inspire action, bring practical and useful information to community members, specialized researchers, and others interested in the history, culture, sociology, politics, and religious experience of our region.
Thank you for joining us for another entertaining and informative La Canoa. It's great to see so many familiar and new faces in the audience. I'm Ana Uremovich. I'm the archivist here at the History and Literary Arts Program, of course, at the National Hispanic Cultural Center. As many of you also know, the reason we're getting these fabulous speakers and a videographer to have us in perpetuity be able to show these wonderful presentations to you is because of our fabulous collaboration with the University of New Mexico Center for Regional Studies. Now, before I do introduce Gabriel Melendez, who is Distinguished Professor of American History and the Director of the Center for Regional Studies, who will introduce our speaker, I wanted to give you just a little heads up on what's coming up for us. There are two of these handouts for you, right over there, so on your way out, please do pick them up. As you are also aware, beside La Canoa, we do have adult book readings. And we have an interesting one coming up in February 10th, Saturday, 2 p.m. It's actually going to be held in the Salon Ortega, just down the hallway here. And it is a book that is called Mole Mama, A Memory of Love, Cooking and Loss. It's a wonderful compilation of her memories of her mother and her culture, but also this fabulous recipe book that talks about the role of mole. And then for La Canoa, next month, on the, February 17th, again here in the library at 2 p.m., we have Assistant Professor of Anthropology, Alex Chavez, coming to us from the University of Notre Dame. And he will be discussing verses and flows, migrant lives, and the sounds of crossing. I will let you read all about the details of it in the flyer. And now, with no further stalling, please welcome Gabriel Melendez.
All right, a major buenas tardes, felices tardes to all of you. And
Light's too hot.
big thank you to each of you for coming. Can you hear me?
No.
Big thank you to each of you for being here this afternoon during flu season and all of the other things that get in our lives. I wanted to just mention, my name is Gabriel Melendez. I'm the Director of the Center for Regional Studies. La Canoa is in its third year. Today's talk is the first of the 2018 year. La Canoa, I will spare you the details on the name, but just suffice to say that it is the reason for La Canoa is to bring you knowledge, to make that knowledge useful and have it delivered to community. This is our community outreach program from the Center for Regional Studies. And I was in near Nogales, Ambos Nogales not long ago, so I was happy to see that there's a little town there called La Canoa. So we're not just limited to New Mexico and our uses of the word. Before I get to the introduction of our speaker today, I want to just give you a little background on the new initiative that we have at the Center for Regional Studies, which is our Visiting Scholars program. And Anita Huizar-Hernández is the first of 2 visiting scholars that will be here at the university for the next semester, approximately the next 15 weeks. Anita will be completing a book project, part of which she'll talk about today. She'll be available to network with UNM faculty in the humanities, social sciences, through the Center for Southwest Research and through the Southwest Hispanic Research Institute and other entities on campus. Now, for this program, you can't apply for this program. You must be nominated. So in the case of Anita, her nomination was made by the associate editor of Rutgers University Press. And we were very happy to receive that nomination. The nomination comes from someone who is seasoned, sound, has great judgment in terms of academic decisions and in terms of scholarship. But now let me tell you a little bit about Anita and her work. She is assistant professor at the University of Arizona in Tucson, where she is in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and also in border studies. She's an affiliated faculty member with the Department of Mexican American Studies, Center for Latin American Studies as well. Her dissertation and her PhD are from the University of California at San Diego. And I'll spare you the title of the dissertation. I think what we're focusing on this afternoon is the forthcoming book. But at Arizona, Anita teaches courses in Spanish department, of course. And some of the courses that she teaches are listed here. I'm going to mention them because it makes me want to be an undergraduate again. So she teaches advanced Spanish for heritage learners, los aragonenses. And you're always looking for these tiny clues when you're working through archives. So there was one. I kept looking into it, and then I saw some of the scope of what Anita will present to you in terms of what kind of land grant and what the aspects of this land grant were. I thought it was so noteworthy that I decided to spread the word among my graduate students and say, this is a fantastic case in the archives. One of you should really take it up. As it turned out, these graduate students were quite advanced in their doctoral dissertation, so no one took the clue, no one took the hint. So when I went to the recovery conference, I really welcomed seeing someone working on this project. And that was my first sort of view of Anita's work. And now here we are, 2018, with her coming to the university to be available as a resource. And perhaps it might take someone like her to get some of the graduate students looking into the archives, right? Because there are treasures there. But with that introduction, it gives me great pleasure to help welcome our CRS visiting scholar for the semester, and of course to have her here at the National Hispanic Cultural Center. Welcome.
Well, first of all, thank you so much to Michael, to Ana, to the National Hispanic Cultural Center. I was blessed to visit here before when I was doing archival research. It's an incredible resource. I wish we had something like this in Arizona, but at least we'll come visit. you all, it gives us a good excuse to come down the road to New Mexico. And thank you, of course, to Professor Melendez and the Center for Regional Studies for bringing me out. I'm thrilled to be here in New Mexico for the spring semester and to be able to not only share my work with you all, but also learn from you all and from New Mexicans who certainly know a lot more about land grants than Arizonans, in my experience, and potentially have more interest in the subject as well. So I'm very excited to be here. So I'm here to talk to you today about the Peralta Land Grant. I have subtitled James Reavis' plan to steal the Southwest. So this is, of course, an unusual land grant story, as we're going to find out today. It's a bizarre case in which an Anglo man, an ex-Confederate soldier from Missouri, found out about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, found out about Spanish-Mexican land grants, and thought, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to make one of those up. And then I'm going to go into the archives and forge a bunch of material and create a long chain of inheritance and find an heiress, connect myself to that heiress, and then claim the land. And what's remarkable about an incredibly outlandish plan is that it almost worked. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. My interest in the case, aside from it being like the plot of a telenovela, which is obviously interesting, is also how recovering this case and what was at stake in this case, in particular what was at stake in the racialization of the heiress, or who James Reavis claimed the heiress was, really speaks to contemporary current concerns and dynamics we have today about the racialization of not only Mexican Americans, but Latinos, and what the consequences legally of that racialization is. Okay, so it's going to cut off a little bit of the slides, but hopefully you all can see the bottom more or less. This is going to be the general flow of what I'm going to cover. I'm going to briefly touch on the historical context, which will be familiar to you all here in New Mexico, and then talk about the details of Reavis' plan, briefly go over the court case, because he eventually did file in U.S. court, as did many Hispanos with actual land grant claims. He also filed that way. Talk about the immediate reactions that mostly happened in newspaper coverage, which was extensive of the case at the time, and then longer term remembrances in terms of fictionalizations. There's a novel, a movie, play, and then the Peralta Land Grant today, and where we are, why I recovered this case, why I talked about this, aside from it being fun. And I should say briefly, I came across this case completely by accident. I was at the Bancroft Library as a graduate student doing a different project about postcards and the Fred Harvey Company, and thinking about tourism in Arizona and the way that it was painted, and I had a few extra days at the very end and asked the archivist if there was any other cool stuff about Arizona that they would like to bring out for me to look at, and they said there was this weird case. People haven't really written about it, and they brought out the trial transcript, and sure enough, it was an incredible, as Gabrielle mentioned, just treasure trove of information that had not been explored, and so that is how I came to this case. I was too advanced of a grad student to go into it in the depth that I wanted to, but then it is the subject of my forthcoming book, which will be coming out with Rutgers University Press, and the title of the book will be Forging Arizona. Okay, so this will be familiar to all of you. It's cutting off a little bit, so I'll read the quote for you. Quote, "The Mexicans shall be maintained and protected in the free enjoyment of their liberty and property." This is, of course, Article 9 of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And as you can see in these two maps, one is Mexico pre-1848, one is Mexico post-1848, and this, as we all know, is how Arizona, California, New Mexico, Texas, Nevada, Colorado, much of nearly half of Mexico's territory became part of the United States. And in addition to territory, the U.S. of course gained people, and they needed to decide what they were going to do with those people, and the treaty did stipulate that those people would be able to maintain the enjoyment of not just their liberty, but also their property. But as you know very well here, that maintaining that enjoyment of property was much easier said than done, right? Even though the government ostensibly recognized the land grants, Spanish and Mexican land grants that were given to people in much more indirect ways, many of those land grants were eventually taken away from their original owners through complex dynamics, economic dynamics, having to mortgage their land to pay for legal fees, taxation that was high, and generally shift to a capitalist economy. And so a lot of people did end up losing their land. However, most of the land claims were eventually validated, right? They just had different owners by the time they were validated. So this dynamic of the transfer of property and the technical recognition of Spanish and Mexican land grants if they went through a specific legal process, was the context that facilitated James Addison's elaborate scheme. He knew about this dynamic, and he worked in a land grant office. He was able to understand the dynamics of what went into one of these claims. And so he was an incredibly ambitious person. He spent nearly 20 years forging archives in Spain, Mexico, and the United States to make up a land grant, to make up a family, to make up an heiress. Of course, there was only one surviving heiress, and then to connect himself with her. So we're going to go a little bit deeper into his plan so you have an idea of what we're talking about. This would have been the Peralta Grant. So the size of this grant, had you been familiar with Spanish and Mexican land grants, should have immediately been a red flag to people in Arizona. As you all know here, but we have less knowledge in Arizona, Spanish and Mexican land grants were normally not this large, nor were they perfect rectangles. So this was a bit of a question. But part of what I think is the importance, and what I argue in my book is the importance of this case, is Reaviss was nearly successful precisely because of the erasure of the pre-US conquest, specifically of Arizona. Right? We have a very different history from New Mexico, and even though we were both part of the same, we were technically the same territory up until the Organic Act in 1863, when we did split, the two territories took very different tracks, different strategies in terms of statehood, right? You all here in New Mexico, mostly because of the demographics, right? Had different access and made a different sort of argument that then later led to what people call the Spanish fantasy heritage, right? Which is more complicated than just saying we're Spanish. But that was part of your argument for statehood in terms of being unique, right? And adding something unique into the United States. Of course, Arizona took a different tack, right? That it was U.S. Anglo pioneers, but there was barely anyone there. There really wasn't a lot of Spanish settlement. The Apaches kept everyone at bay. And so we're starting from scratch, right? Just a classic sort of terra nullius U.S. expansion thing. And what I see in the book is this argument was obviously false, right? This was a highly finessed narrative, but it was extremely successful to the point where most people even today don't question that argument. But the fact that Reaviss was able to convince people in the territory, make millions of dollars selling quit claims to the Southern Pacific Railroad, to mines, to individual homesteaders, just based on this, it really speaks to the lack of understanding of that history and how successful this, what I call counterfeit narrative, was. Okay, so you have a better idea of who the people are that were actually impacted by this in this, is this on? Can I move around? Okay, I think so. Can you still hear me? This is good now? Okay, I can speak loud. I'll do my teacher voice. So this is the Arizona-New Mexico line. So you can see here, just a little sliver of Western Mexico actually wouldn't have included Silver City, so just west of Silver City. And then in terms of what it was including in territorial Arizona, so Phoenix is right here in the corner. Tempe, you see Florence over here, and very importantly, Stafford, Pima, Sullivanville. All of these are important mining lands, right? So you have agriculture, you have mining, and Reaviss too, of course, this is extremely valuable land. If you're going to invent a land grant, you can pick the best land you want, right? So that's what he did. He picked the best land, and of course, it also included an Indian reservation, which is part of the dynamic here. So what did Reaviss need to do? Really, his plan involved two different parts, right? One part was just inventing the creation of this grant. So he needed to go into the archives and forge a letter from the King of Spain saying that he was granting this land to Don Miguel Peralta, right? Who supposedly had done wonderful things in the territory of Arizona, and that's why he was getting a land grant, similar to actual land grants, right? So Reaviss had different strategies in terms of how he forged these archives depending on where they were, how long he had to access them, right? So in some cases, like this page on the left is an entirely forged page. So he would create a page at home, sneak it into the archive, and then paste it into an actual record. So the book itself would be authentic and could be authenticated and looked real to experts, right? But then the page was forged. This page is also completely forged. But sometimes he would take a page that was real, he was able to determine how to create a chemical mixture that would erase the ink, and then he would just write over a part of a page. Or sometimes he would lift seals, like the case of the seal over here, from a different document, and then later attach the seal to one of his official documents granting the grant. So he was able to trace through collecting this archival evidence in Guadalajara and in Spain the creation of this grant. But just creating the grant itself was not enough. Like, that was in the mid-1700s, supposedly, that this letter went out from the King of Spain. Reaviss is starting his plan in the 1870s. So what to do with that 100-year history? You invent a family. So this is a picture of the genealogical tree of the family. This actually on the left is Don Miguel Nemesio. He's the first Baron of Arizona. This is a picture of him at 30 years old. Reaviss sometimes had pictures, supposedly at 30 years old, sometimes had pictures commissioned in San Francisco. He had people paint them, but he also sometimes just found pictures that looked old of people that were maybe Spanish and just pretended that they were related to this grant. This is just some, there are hundreds of images of all these people. This woman here, that's Doña Sofia Ana Maria Sanchez. She's the first baroness. It was her at 60 years, that's what the caption says. And this is Don Jose Antonio Sanchez, who's the father, supposedly, of the first baroness. Right? So there's an image of everyone. And this whole elaborate genealogical tree went all the way from the 1700s, from the first Baron of Arizona, to Reaviss's moment in the 1870s, and led all to this one woman. So this image really encapsulates how Reaviss was able to bring together the two different strands of his elaborate scheme. He invented the grant, and supposedly in the letter to the king it said that they marked on a rock one of the outermost boundaries of the grant. So this is supposedly the rock, which of course Reaviss just chiseled into himself. And this is the woman. So for me, this is the most interesting and tragic part of the case. So Reaviss created this family, and through a series of tragic events in this imaginary family, everybody dies. This woman was a twin, supposedly. Even the twin died. She's an orphan. Very Cinderella type story. She ends up an orphan in California. Uncertain parentage. People don't really know where she came from. Reaviss meets her on a train on the way to Sacramento. Because of the way that she looked, he thought she must be a Spanish baroness, which is a very kind of interesting thing to claim about a person. He began talking to her, and this is what he testified at the trial in Santa Fe. After talking to her, he decided that it was likely that she was the last heiress to this Peralta claim. Convinced her, maybe it's unclear, and I'll get to that later, what her thoughts were about this entire sort of saga. But claimed she is the last heiress, and so what does he do to connect himself with her claim? He marries her. And she becomes Sofia Peralta Reavis. So now, as his wife, and as you know, Spanish common law, which impacts the states here, Arizona, New Mexico, the formerly Mexican territories, women were able to maintain their property rights, but in the U.S. system, the husbands took over, right, the women's property rights. And so he was able to use her claim once they were married to claim land himself. So he sued the federal government in Peralta Reavis v. United States for the validation of this land, right? So because he had this two-part plan, the federal government in response had sort of a two-pronged approach to debunking the validity of this claim. The first part was more straightforward, and that was in terms of analyzing which documents were forged and how they were forged. Right? So Reaviss was able to get backers from all across the country. New York, San Francisco, very well-respected, very famous lawyers at the time claimed that they had reviewed the documents and that they were all accurate, and that was how he was able to get quick claims and get more and more money. He established the Casa Grande Land Improvement Company. He sold shares in that company, and this is how he was able to fundraise. During the years before this grant went to trial, he and Sofia Peralta Reavis, and they had twin sons, who I didn't include a photo of, but they dressed them up in like velvet jumpsuits and took them to Spain and had them play with Spanish royalty. I took pictures of it all. So that whole they were able to do that because people had invested and they were conned by this man. But none of these people were actual subject experts in Spanish-Mexican land grants, and none of them spoke Spanish. So when this trial was happening, and when the government hired experts, they hired a man named Reaviss Plan, who spoke Spanish and was an expert in this history. He immediately noticed some glaring inconsistencies. And then another man, Will Tipton, who's a handwriting expert, was also able to track some of the ways that they were able to prove that these were forgeries. This, for example, is the forged will of the first Baron. So after Reaviss forged the granting of land from the king to Miguel in Mexico, of course he needed a will, right, to then start the process of the genealogical tree. This forged will was inserted by Reaviss into the records of the mission San Javier del Bac, which if you've been to Tucson, the White Hill of the Desert, that church just a little bit south of Tucson is very beautiful. It's on an Odo land. So when the experts went in to look at this document, even though it looked real, something that the other people who weren't as familiar with the system of archives from the Spanish period didn't know is that there's a table of contents in the different book. So they went to the table of contents, and of course this particular aspect of the volume is the only one that's not listed in the table of contents. That was one big red flag. Reaviss was also not aware of course, as you all would know, the Spaniards took incredible records and they made copies. So if there was a record in Mexico, there was a matching record in Spain, right, of whatever had happened. Reaviss didn't know this, neither did the people that he conned, and so he would only forge one of the records, not knowing about the existence of another one. He also, the handwriting expert, was able to analyze things like the shape of the S, which wouldn't have been consistent with the shape of the S that was being used by the Spanish court at that time. They were able to analyze that the way that the ink was on the page indicated it was from a steel pen, which of course there weren't steel pens in the mid-1700s when these documents would have been created. And my personal favorite, there were grammatical errors. As a professor of Spanish, I like to use this example with my students that he did not apparently have a good mastery of the subjunctive, and so there were errors in the subjunctive that are sort of telltale signs of second language learners. So I tell my students, you never know, you learn the subjunctive, you might be profitable, right, or not. So that was much simpler in terms of debunking the authenticity of these documents. What was more complicated and what was the most interesting part of the trial transcript, which is like over 1,000 pages long, is everything that has to do with Sofia, Peralta Land, right? So this quote that's a bit cut off. This comes from the climax of the trial, June 17th, 1895. They've been talking, all these different witnesses, debunking the documents. Sofia's in the court every single day, but not saying anything. She finally takes the stand, and the U.S. government attorney, they go back and forth. It comes out that she actually doesn't know how to read, and so she wasn't able to look at the documents herself, right? This is a woman that you found in poverty in California, right? And so after that comes out, she bursts into tears on the stand. They take a break, they come back, and the U.S. government attorney finally asks her point blank, don't you know that you're impersonating someone who never existed, the Baroness of Arizona? And her response, incredibly, was, no, sir, I did not know I was personating anybody but myself. And remarkably, at the end of this case, they actually never did rule on the identity of Sofia Peralta Reavis. That was an open question. They, of course, were able to determine that she wasn't a Peralta because of an elected family. But the court refused to rule, even though the government attorney wanted them to, as to her racial identity. So much of the language of the court surrounding her was whether or not she was Spanish or she was a so-called half-breed Indian, right? Because there were all of these people in her hometown in California who gave testimony that she was actually the illegitimate child of an Anglo trader named John Treadway, who was also from Missouri, can you believe this? And a Native American woman named Kate, who then abandoned her when she was a child, according to these other witnesses, right? So the trial transcript, all of these different people are trying to analyze how do you determine what someone's race is, right? They talk about whether or not she speaks Spanish, they talk about her behavior, they talk about the people she associates with. So you see how gender and class end up being an important part of how people's race is identified, right? But they never determine, and the the Chief Justice of the court says, to me, I think she seems Spanish, but it's not for us to rule. It's beyond the purview of the court. It was an open question at the time. So of course, this case was big news. At the end of the 1800s, you saw the map. That's a large amount of territory. It involved railroads, it involved mines, it involved the Homestead Act, it involved the Dawes Act, a lot of different things in terms of westward expansion came together in this case. And so newspapers all across the country and internationally covered the Peralta Grant, even though we don't really talk about it as much today. And then later, it was remembered in fiction, in film. There's a novel that I look at. There's a film with Vincent Price that I'll show you a few images from where he plays James Reavis. He's a very charismatic con artist. But the immediate reaction in the 1900s, this one was reprinted all over the country, the Midwest, the Northeast, Southwest, the Northwest, truly everywhere, and was even picked up in England. It read, "Cap sheaf of fraud, scheme of James Addison Reavis, staggers fiction, most astounding swindle ever attempted. The hero was a streetcar conductor. His wife played the role of heiress," right? So you see this yellow journalism that was popular at the time, very sensationalized facts of the case. But what's interesting is that there is no agreement in terms of the actual race of the racial identity of Sofia, right? The newspapers kind of go back and forth. They talk about different people. They talk about her pretending to be an heiress, but there's no consensus, right, in the immediate aftermath. That changes with time. So you see here, this is from the Saturday Evening Post, 1947. This is an artist rendering of James Reavis and Sofia, although he did often dress her up in a mantilla, so that is accurate. And this is the caption of this image. It says, "Carmelita." There was some fictional rememberings where they changed her name from Sofia to Carmelita, and so then that became the popular way to refer to her. The illiterate kitchen drudge who fully believed Reavis' story that she was descended from Spanish kings, heiress to titles and vast wealth. So you see with time there's a vilification of Sofia Carmelita and how she becomes more Mexican than Spanish, and it's a very classed rhetoric, right, in terms of her being illiterate, a kitchen drudge, and wanting to be someone that she was not, and transgressing these different borders that she shouldn't have been transgressing. And this is by Clarence White who's a famous Western author at the time. He wrote the novel Arizona, which then became the 1940 film Arizona. If you've ever been to Tucson Film Studios in Arizona, they built that for that particular film, Arizona. It's like a blockbuster at the time. These images you can't see them totally. You can see the good one is Vincent Price. So then, a few years later in 1950, this is from a promotional poster for the Baron of Arizona, a Samuel Fuller film. Samuel Fuller was more known for war films. He's most famous for the first film about the Korean War, which he did while the Korean War was still happening. Sort of a weird blip in his cinematic life was this B film noir. It's an over-the-top romance. Vincent Price plays James Reavis. He's a total ladies' man. He romances a gypsy woman in Spain and cons Sofia, but of course it has a happy ending and they all come together at the end. And the promotional poster had this quote, "Women fought for his kisses, men clamored for his life." There's a mob scene and almost a hanging. It's very Western. But you can see here that Sofia is played by Ellen Drew, who was a Hollywood starlet at the time, very well known for her girl next door look. So there's an erasure completely in this film in terms of the racial dynamics of Sofia Peralta Reavis, right? And she looks extremely different than the image that we have of the actual real-life woman, right? And is notably much, much lighter than the real-life woman. So why talk about this? Why remember the Peralta Land Grant, and what does this mean to us today? This is from the Santa Fe Weekly New Mexican and Livestock Journal, March 22nd, 1894, and it said, "Whatever the decision of the court may be, the name Peralta will be a familiar one in the Southwest for generations to come." So this, of course, is not true, right? Especially in Arizona. He was the Baron of Arizona. This was huge news at the time. Territorial governors had to go on the record as to their opinion about the Peralta Grant land case while this was going on. I was born and raised in Phoenix. I do archival work. This is not a case, certainly, that is familiar for at least this generation, right? Very few people know about it, and what people do know about it is sort of sketchy. So when I began looking into this, I thought, why? Why have we forgotten this? It's sort of like an interesting bit of trivia, and there's a way to read it as, this is fun, and we should know more about the past. And there's also an aspect to this case that cannot be remembered, in particular, the dynamics of the racialization of the woman, Sofia Peralta Reavis, because what that story really is about, and what that trial transcript really shows us, is that racial categories are always uncertain because they are built on a shaky foundation, right? Racial identity is it's a social construct, and what that shows in the trial transcript is if it's a social construct, even if that construct has concrete consequences, it can be manipulated, right? By all different sides. And we still have this anxiety today in terms of how do you determine who is Latino and what does it mean to be Latino, in particular in Arizona. This is a highly contentious topic of who is Latino and what does the racialization of those people mean in terms of their U.S. citizenship and the rights that they can claim based on being U.S. citizens. So I want to continue with this image, which was a protest poster from SB 1070, which you all will remember was the 2010 now infamous law. And I have here a little quote, since it's cut off at the top, I'll just go ahead and read it. This is from the most controversial provision of the bill. For any lawful contact made by a law enforcement official or agency of the state or a county, city, town, or other political subdivision of the state where reasonable suspicion exists that the person is an alien who is unlawfully present in the United States, a reasonable attempt shall be made, when practicable, to determine the immigration status of the person. So this really gets to the crux of what this case is about, right? How do you know what is reasonable suspicion, and how can you determine the immigration status of a person just by looking at them, right? Critics of the law obviously said, this is not only legalizing, it's mandating racial profiling of the state's large Latino population. But then you have the other side saying, no, we're going to do all this training, and we're just going to determine on a variety of factors that are completely objective, that just have to do with, whether or not they have an accent, and other things. So this confliction that we see that continues, right, continues to haunt us and continues to be a part of the history of Arizona, and I would argue that the only reason we can have SB 1070, we can have people buying into this, is because of a lack of understanding, right, of the multi-ethnic, multinational, layered past of the state and of the Southwest in general. So with that, thank you.
But are we really good one of the dominant exponents of racial profiling?
Yes, I mean, he was part of it, so he literally got away with that. But there, so I'm glad that you mentioned Joe Arpaio. I'm sure you all know he's now running for Senate, because he's supposed to be in jail, but he was pardoned. But that is a good example, I think, of how complex these issues are today, right? Because he was voted out of office before that court case was finally determined. So it's not a sort of simple linear narrative. There are people who are tapping into this, but what I think the Peralta Grant shows us is this whole debate of how does the Latino community fit in, and how does being Latino fit in with these ideas about citizenship and belonging. These have long roots. This is not an Arpaio issue. This is not a 2010 issue, right? The roots of SB 1070 go back way farther than that, and are only possible because people don't know their history, right? Like, it's not a coincidence that SB 1070 passed, and then a few months later, HB 2281 passed, which is the ethnic studies ban. Right? In order for people to accept this kind of narrative, you can't be teaching things that show how these narratives are false.
Did the Baroness speak English? I'm curious.
Yes, so actually she didn't speak Spanish, and that was part of the issue. On the stand, there was much discussion as to why she didn't speak Spanish with the people in the, she was from Yolo County, California, and people asked her, why didn't you speak Spanish with the various women that you encountered who testified that she didn't speak Spanish? And she said, well, I couldn't speak Spanish with them because they wanted to brand me as an Indian. And so I wasn't allowed to speak Spanish. And there's a very sort of strange, in terms of language ideology, that James Reavis makes this argument that, well, no, she didn't speak Spanish because she was raised by this Anglo man, she was an orphan, but when she does speak Spanish, it's perfectly clear with no accent whatsoever. As if there's sort of like this inherent ability to speak Spanish that's related, again, to your racial identity, this racial imaginary that doesn't actually make sense with the head currency. I brought the film, but then I realized I don't have a CD-ROM on my laptop. But I can show you the film, and it's actually accessible on the internet. With the Criterion Collection, it's great.
I saw that movie a long time ago.
So it's streaming online. You can watch it, part of the Criterion Collection, and it's an incredible film. There's a lot more to say about the film if you want to talk about that.
When you mentioned what can we learn at present from his case, I have another sort of look at angle on it. When you go to the entire record of the Surveyor General and the Court of Private Land Claims, there's like 300 or so land grants in New Mexico that are the documents for each one of those, for the smallest communities, up here to Jimenez, anywhere you go in New Mexico, there's this massive cache of documents related to each one of those land grants, right? And this was material collected by the federal government, by the U.S. government, right? So I think what it tells you is how much was at stake in terms of ownership of land and the adjudication of the lands, right? And more so in New Mexico, perhaps in Arizona. So when this case comes up, it's so out of stitch that the one thing it tells you, a lot of people were interested in this resolution of this.
And the federal government did offer him money to just settle, right? They didn't want to risk going to court, but he refused the money because he just wanted all of the land, right? And the argument was all about progress. We need to build a railroad, we need to get sort of compliant, we can't have this uncertainty, right? Because it will slow down the progress of the Southwest and Northeast territories. And they could not allow for that.
So since he lost the case, what did happen to him afterwards? And why did they stay together?
Yes, thank you for that. I skipped over the sort of denouement of this case. So he went to jail for 5 years in the Santa Fe Penitentiary. And he then tried to, he's a con artist, so when he got out, he tried to make a career of telling his confessions. So he started a newspaper that only had one issue, that was the James Reavis Real Life Illustrated, True Confessions. This is the first installment, more to come, but there was only ever one. He just was trying to keep making money now off of the story as opposed to the land. Sofia ended up moving to Denver with her 2 children and eventually filed for divorce on grounds of non-support from James Reavis. And they did, in fact, divorce, and she died and is buried in a pauper's grave in Denver. So it's really, the part about her is the most interesting and also the most tragic, because this was a real person. And another part that I look at in terms of people who are interested in doing archival research about marginalized communities, and in particular women of color, of course the archives don't have testimonies all the time. There are a lot of testimonials, but in the case of Sofia Peralta Reavis and so many other women of color, we have to look for them, in the interstices of the stories, right? So I look at her as much as possible in terms of what she claims on the stand, incredibly, that she's not impersonating a person. That's the last word, literally, that we have from her, and then she sort of disappears.
Why was the case adjudicated in New Mexico?
Because of the structure of the Court of Land Claims, there were more land grants here in New Mexico, and of course Arizona was part of the New Mexico territory before this, and so the Surveyor General office in Arizona, it went to Mexico when it went to the higher court.
Was there a White Mountain Apache land grant, or how did the Apache view this, suddenly to have a land grant over their property?
So I tried to look into this, and from what I've seen, so that was already sort of, it's a reservation, they didn't have the same the relationship to the land was different than these homesteaders and these corporations, of course. But they never paid Reaviss a quitclaim, right? And part of that is because it was federal government land, so it was being sort of managed, that dynamic, through them. And it doesn't seem like anyone there thought that Reaviss, they were not tricked by him in the way that other people were, in particular these like Anglo pioneer people that were more freaked out by the possibility of it. Yes.
Two questions. Thanks so much for a terrific presentation on that. The first question is, was Reaviss in the Battle of Peralta? And no?
No. Unfortunately.
Yeah. I was thinking maybe.
You're like, that would be so great.
And then the other question, I've been reading about the Cruzate grants, land grants in western New Mexico also, that one of them having to do with Laguna Pueblo. And the same Tipton that weighs in on handwriting on documents and stuff was putting into question the validity of the Cruzate grants. And there was a big argument about how old a community Laguna Pueblo really is, since it wasn't mentioned in so many of the trip chronicles and stuff like that. Mark Simmons thought it didn't even start till after the Pueblo Revolt, but it turns out scholars have really been looking at the way these copies are made. And the original Cruzate documents are no longer existing, but a convincing case has been made despite Tipton. Tipton said, well, the signatures are written by the same scribe, the same writer as the text of the grant and everything. And historians now are saying, no, that was just the copyist, and these are indeed older communities than some people are saying, and there's archaeology to back it up too.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because part of the real danger of this case at the time, right, was that it gave all of these people, who of course didn't want to validate these claims, fodder, right? They said, see, this is what we've been saying. They're all fake, right? And you see this collapsing in terms of the newspaper coverage in particular of real land grants with the Reaviss grant, and of federal officials using Reaviss's scheme, which was so transparently made up, to then call into question land grants in general and say, and a political issue, as you know, we need to just get through this process as soon as possible. We need to move on. We need to have progress and investment, and of course, there's so much federal investment in the western states. We need to just breeze past this, right? So it's extremely damaging that the Reaviss case existed. It just gave so much power to people like Tipton and to the government attorneys, right? And also to just public opinion, right? The public opinion on land grants in places like Arizona, where settlers were already, very concerned about losing their homesteads. And then when they found out that Reaviss was put out the ground as a fake, they were just painting with sort of a broad brush all Spanish and Mexican land grants as dangerous, anti-American, really. And even in the later studies of the Peralta grant, so the last really amazing, painstakingly researched, comprehensive study of this particular case came out in 1960. Donald Powell, who was archivist at the University of Arizona, where I teach special collections, he went through painstaking all this newspaper coverage, but even he, in rehearsing the details of the case, also sort of gestures towards this conflation of Spanish-Mexican land grants as not being authentic and as causing problems, right? Even in his study, which is talking about how this one was fake, he also sort of feeds into that narrative of, well, they're all fake, right?
Was Reaviss involved in any other frauds or crimes before he got involved in this?
So yes, his original, so according to the lore, I haven't found anything to substantiate this, but supposedly the way that he figured out that he was such a successful forger was when he was a Confederate soldier, he sort of saw the writing on the wall that they weren't going to win, and forged his commanding officer's signature so he could pass through the battle lines to the north and escape the fight, supposedly, right? So that would sort of be the original fraud, and then when he was working in Missouri, he got teamed up with a real estate lawyer there, and they called him the old Spanish grant lawyer, who, like had Spanish papers that he would then finesse, and people would go to this guy to perfect their titles. So Reaviss was part of this, and then I didn't go into this. There were actually two separate claims that James Reavis made. So the first claim was without Sofia, and according to that claim, which didn't go anywhere because there were too many holes in the story, he and another man had bought the title to the Peralta Grant from the great-great-great-grandson, who would have been Sofia's father, right before he died, like around a campfire in rural Arizona. But there were too many holes in that, so while that was sort of going through the courts and he could see that the Surveyor General was going to have problems with that, he simultaneously started, well, I'll just do one generation more, I'll find Sofia, I'll find an orphan, I'll make her this heiress, I'll marry her, and that's a more solid chain of inheritance. So it was a very sort of complicated series of frauds, and in terms of what other frauds he did, this was going on for 20 years. So he didn't live in Arizona while this was happening. He couldn't live in Arizona while this was happening because he was a wanted man by the settlers, and you still have significant frontier justice in Arizona in this time period, right? This is not like a safe place to be if you're a not well-liked person, and so he technically had a house in Casa Grande, but he mostly lived in San Francisco. And so he was involved constantly getting more backers because he needed a lot of money to finance his trips to Spain and Mexico. This was not a wealthy man, but he needed someone to finance, his luxurious lifestyle because he felt it was important to live like a baron, to be believed as a baron. Having like really beautiful clothes and supposedly a horse and carriage, all these white horses that would drive him to the court, and then just going overseas to Spain and staying there for extended periods of time. So that was all part of this fraud, and then eventually the land company and selling shares in that company. His argument was that he wanted to develop irrigation in Arizona, ironically, because then he wanted to create dams, essentially. When the Roosevelt Dam in 1920. So he was sort of a precursor to that, but he was able to sell shares through this argument. So he conned a lot of people inside and outside of his territory, for sure.
Well, even if his use of the subjunctive wasn't perfect, was he self-taught in Spanish? How did he?
So there's a big gap in terms of what happened to him, sort of in between the end of the Civil War and the late 1870s, when he starts really getting into this scheme. But so, they've at least traced him to Brazil. Powell traced him to Brazil, and so it's likely that he was in Latin America for an extended period of time and learned Spanish there. He was an intelligent person, clearly. I mean, he was able to, it wasn't a perfect scheme, he didn't know about table of contents and things like that, and he wasn't exactly clear on how Spanish colonialism worked, but he was clear enough to be able to create entirely forged documents that looked real to people that weren't experts. So he put that considerable intellect, unfortunately, into this nefarious project.
Anita, I'm wondering how far the reach of your research is in terms of looking at cases where particularly Anglo-Texans married Mexican women to then be part of land grants. It also happened in Mexico, but have you looked into that in the corner of it?
Yes, so specifically in Arizona, in both Tempe, Phoenix, and also Tucson, not so much with land grants, but there was a strong history of Anglo men marrying Mexican women for, we don't have as many land grants, but like property and wealth and status and standing in general. There's a family in Tempe that I did work on where they owned water rights. And so there's cases of Anglo men marrying those Mexican women for those water rights. So that's another way that this case seemed believable, right? Because it seemed believable that an Anglo man would marry a wealthy Mexican woman and that joining would lead to gaining more property. So certainly it's similar to what we see in California, Maria Louisa Burton, right, where she has a lot of land and she ends up marrying Burton. what you see in Texas, the Jovita Gonzalez is now a caballero, and gesturing towards that history of Anglos, and certainly here as well. Yeah, so if you think about, the major people in Arizona, people that street names are named after, like McClinton, kind of Mexican wife, Sam Hughes in Tucson, that's like the very nice neighborhood next to U of A. I don't live there, but they're beautiful houses in that neighborhood. He had a Mexican wife. Right.
Anglo men here in New Mexico, very, very common. Not only Anglo men, but the first trappers in another part of the state married women with.
And our history in Arizona is slightly different from here, right? Really, from what I've read in terms of the work on New Mexico, it seemed like those Anglo men, at least in an earlier period of time, were sort of Hispanicized and became part of the community. That's what I've read. It was not the case in Arizona that happened, right? It was like a reverse dynamic, and a lot of that has to do with numbers, right? The number of people and the ratio that shifted very dramatically and quickly in Arizona of Mexicans as compared to Anglos, which was in terms of the statewide profile versus here. Oh, yeah.
It reminds me a little bit of Bernie Madoff. And I think one thing is you have to keep up appearances, and then another aspect is one lie leads to having to invent another lie.
Exactly, and as you say, he was keeping up appearances and he created this web of lies, and similar to Madoff and other con artists, once one lie falls, there's a domino effect, right? So the trial disintegrates very quickly. He had Robert Ingersoll, who was a U.S. ambassador, and he had the chair of the American Bar Association. He had real powerful people who were his backers, but as soon as they got word of these inconsistencies in the documents, he ended up not having any representation at the trial in Santa Fe in 1885. So he kept stalling and stalling. If you're reading the trial transcript, like he doesn't show up for the first 3 or 4 days, and finally he sends a telegram to the court that he's on his way and he wants to stay, and they say no. And so he finally comes and he ends up representing himself at the trial, which is very entertaining in terms of the trial. He's not a trained lawyer and says all kinds of crazy things at the trial. But exactly that's what happened.
What year was this,
95 was when it actually came to trial. He filed the first claim in 1883. Then it was even working this way.
And where was the trial?
Here in Santa Fe. So much of the newspaper coverage is from the New Mexican, and then reprinted through the wire service.
I think you mentioned the examination and cross-examination of Sofia. He was so charged and kind of pointed, and it seemed to rest, the whole entire scheme seemed to rest on whether her identity could be established or not. But I seem to remember something about the transcript of that trial being quite extensive.
Extremely extensive, and it is that, to me at least, is the climax of the trial transcript, is just reading this woman, because James Reavis had a lot at stake. He had millions of dollars that he had stolen from all kinds of different people, and a reputation and a certain lifestyle, but Sofia had everything at stake. This was her entire identity, and it's unclear. There's no way for us to know if she believed Reavis, if she was playing along, if she was in on the scheme, what kind of her understanding of what was happening. But it is truly incredible that a woman who at least was raised, she was a servant in other people's homes because she was an orphan in California, would then take the stand at a U.S. court and say, no, I never knew I was personating anybody but myself. It's an incredibly bold thing for a marginalized woman to claim and to say, right? And that's where her testimony ends, right? After this back and forth, it's very dramatic, and she cries, and they stop it, and her children are there, and when she starts crying, her children start crying, and it's an incredibly tumultuous scene. But those are her last words.
And maybe it is true. Maybe he conned her to the point You know, we know of many of these kinds of cases. I mean, Mrs. Madoff claims she didn't know anything about it. And the courts found it, but she didn't know exactly what it was doing.
Well, and in that sense, and what I look at in the book is in terms of the history of passing in the United States, this makes perfect sense, right? Whether she knew it or not, it makes sense to pass if you are able to, as someone else, if that allows you greater access to certain privileges, right? Related to class, related to race, related to citizenship, related to whatever, right? And so she joins sort of this larger history of passing as well.
What's going to be the name of your book?
Forging Arizona.
Okay.